Story 1. My family owns a plot of land near several major highways. There are many fruit trees in the area. Please build the city adjacent to the land so its value increases. Story 2. People are saying Singapore, but it is already pretty packed. Story 3. The island of Kehawalawi in Hawaii is difficult for everyone to reach, so visitors would need to make their time there worthwhile. Story 4. If we were a world government, we would be called Man United. Therefore, the capital should be Man City. Story 5. You want a location that is not a major city so that when leaders of the world meet there, it does not invite immediate gridlock or rioting protesters. It should have good security, good airport access, and be in a country that is at least somewhat neutral in its relations with the world superpowers. How about Cabo Verde? It is an island country off the coast of West Africa and is reportedly one of the most democratic countries in Africa. Story 6. Either like an island in the middle of nowhere or Greenland. Story 7. There should be at least one for each continent. Story 8. Geneva is already neutral and home to global institutions. Story 9. I don't know how no one is mentioning Istanbul, historically known as Constantinople. It is located between two continents, Europe and Asia. You have access to the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, as well as the Black Sea. You can reach the majority of the world's population hubs within a 12-hour flight. Geographically, there are very few places that can top Istanbul. Story 10. Minecraft. That way, they would stop justifying billions of tons of carbon emissions to fly their wasteful asses around. Story 11. Singapore, The Hague, or Geneva. No other nation or city has the global governance infrastructure and neutrality at that scale. Story 12. It should be located on a Pacific island, as a neutral ground between the world's great powers and not directly connected to any one of them. The fact that many such islands are endangered by sea level rise should remind us that we must do more to prevent it. The problem is that there are far too many corporate sociopaths and autocratic narcissists for a world government to emerge that is not ultimately designed to serve some group of billionaires. A truly egalitarian global government can exist only when billionaires and similar figures no longer hold sway over humanity. Story 13. The world capital should rotate each year. Story 14. London was the capital of 1/3 of the planet at one point, so it has been the closest to a world headquarters. Story 15. There is a suburb of Toronto, Canada, called Brampton. It would be the best location for the headquarters of a world government. Story 16. It would have to be a compromise between various members of the United Nations Security Council, so Rio, Athens, or Singapore seem likely. Story 17. You would want to do what they did with the District of Columbia and build a new city from the ground up specifically to serve the function of being the seat of government. Story 18. Unironically, Palestine and Israel have been a symbol of conflict for centuries. Converting them into a symbol of peace would be profound. A world government could not succeed until that is accomplished. The region lies at the nexus of Asia, Africa, and Europe, near one of the cradles of human civilization. Story 19. Culaz is situated beneath a cliff face, so it could be at risk if typical government activities destabilize the area. Story 20. The traditional choice is usually Geneva, Switzerland. Story 21. If it's a benevolent world government like the Star Trek Federation, I would choose The Hague in the Netherlands. If it's a classic Orwellian oppressive government, I would choose London, as in V for Vendetta, or a brutalist Bond villain lair in Greenland. Story 22. It is probably the one with a few buildings still standing after the war. Story 23. Halifax, Nova Scotia. Not for any particular reason except that it sounds very cool. Story 24. I am fond of placing the world capital in Nairobi. The city has improved greatly over the past 2 decades and is on track to continue doing so. Nairobi is a fitting theoretical world capital because it lies in the region where humans first evolved, and Kenya, as the original homeland of humankind, seems an appropriate location. Story 25. San Francisco. Not too far from Europe or Asia. Beautiful. Story 26. Baghdad offers something different. Civilization was born in the area, and it's at a crossroads of today's major population centers. Story 27. As an American, I support making London the world capital. I think it has better security and intelligence services. Story 28. Create one city at the North Pole and one at the South Pole. Have a snail choose its favorite piece of lettuce to decide which city will be the capital, but only after construction of both cities is complete. The losing city becomes a haven for penguins, polar bears, or both. Also give the decision snail a monument in its hometown the size of a moderately large tortoise. Story 29. My hometown. It would be nice to see the old place get a little boost to its economy. The real answer, though, would probably be somewhere in Oceania. Or build a bridge between the Diomede Islands and make it a single location. Story 30. Resolute. Nunavut. Story 31. London is the center of the known universe. Everyone takes their time from it. Story 32. Probably Baghdad, Iraq. It is not too far from the power centers of the old world, Europe, the rising dragon China, whatever nickname is used for India, the future of industrialization in Africa, and the religious turmoil of the Middle East. In this scenario, most of the New World is left out, so I propose a dual capital city civilization like Rome and Byzantium. The other city would be Panama City, Panama. Story 33. Existing city? I would eliminate Switzerland because although it has never been directly involved in wars, far too much blood money and assets flow through it. Establishing a world government headquarters there would amplify these problems. I would propose two nations, Costa Rica and Iceland. A remote city in Iceland would be best. It would likely attract far more tourist traffic than the country wants, but that could be managed. The city should be totally remote and secluded, hosting only official business and no tourist attractions. Story 34. They should build an island city at Point Nemo and make it the capital. Story 35. Bentonville, Arkansas, is already the world capital of capitalism and the shadow government there. Story 36. It would probably be best to build a new city for this. It should have good public transportation, robust infrastructure, and be cosmopolitan enough to welcome people from around the world. Obvious choices like Geneva could not cope with the extra load, and New York might work only if the host country were willing to participate. The best option may be a purpose-built world capital. Purpose-built capitals are common. Building one from the ground up would allow getting the infrastructure right from the start. It should be on an empty plot of land whose current country is willing to relinquish sovereignty. Most of Europe is too densely settled for that, unless one chooses a place such as the Spanish desert. Other possibilities include Kamchatka or Tierra del Fuego, where almost nobody lives, or reclaiming land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with the help of Dutch engineers. Story 37. Let us place Jerusalem under international jurisdiction and make it the capital of the world. Then people would stop fighting over it. It is geographically at the crossroads of 3 continents and is already significant to much of the population of the world. Story 38. Let it reside in cyberspace, where everyone can join remotely from anywhere in the world. Story 39. Astana has been designed and built for exactly this purpose. Go ahead and take a look. Story 40. Singapore. All trade passes through it. It has clear borders and is already neutral and rich enough that no one would hate being ruled by Singaporeans. Story 41. It would need to be in a reasonably neutral location between the spheres of influence of superpowers, with enough historical significance to minimize complaints. For example, Istanbul. Bonus points if it is not already the capital of its country. Story 42. Ulm. Make the Europa Universalis 4 and Stellaris memes real. Story 43. Jerusalem is sacred to 3 major religions, so taking it over for politicians seems like a good move. Story 44. Istanbul is at the crossroads of 3 continents. It is a culturally rich city overflowing with history, having been the center of multiple empires. The weather is good, and Turkey is relatively neutral and stable, all things considered. Story 45. Choose a city that is central but not too crowded. Most of Asia is not suitable because it lacks the necessary infrastructure. Do not choose an island. Somewhere in Germany could work well. Brussels could also be a good option, since the European Union is already based there and you could simply add more chairs. Story 46. A suitable location could be Chennai on the east coast of India. More people live in Southeast Asia than in any other region, so this choice is fairer for most people worldwide. For Eastern Europe, it would not be much farther than a major city such as New York or Los Angeles is for Western Europe. The distance to New York and Los Angeles would be roughly equal. For several highly populated countries in Africa, it would be closer than if the capital were in the Americas. It would be a longer journey from South America, but wherever the new capital is built, someone will always be the furthest away, so apologies to the people of the Americas. Story 47. I am not sure which city would be a better candidate than Geneva, Switzerland. Story 48. A purpose-built city in Central Asia or the Balkans that captures an East meets West vibe. Story 49. Anchorage, Alaska, is unusually equidistant from many major cities around the world, though it is not very large. Story 50. My vote goes to Helsinki. Finland seems to have its affairs in order more than any other country. Story 51. People keep trying to find a neutral place, but the geopolitics of the time will influence the choice, and economically important regions will matter. Since a world government could exist only by force, it is hard to predict which places will be destroyed or remain intact. It depends on how such a government arises. Any answer could be plausible, close to modern reality such as Geneva or New York City, reflecting an Asian century such as Tokyo or Shanghai, or imagining long-term potential somewhere in Africa. If technology allows it, my answer would be the moon or a giant space station, which is as neutral as it gets. Story 52. As an American, I would not choose the United States. I have heard of enough foolish politicians at home without including those from other countries. I would choose somewhere in Europe, such as the United Kingdom or a country with a rich political history like Italy. Personally, Geneva. We have already ended one war there. Story 53. Constantinople is the obvious choice. Rome knew what it was doing. Panama City is the second choice. But realistically, it would probably be in a country that would be a compromise. Panama and Turkey are too pro-Western. Something like Singapore or Rio de Janeiro would probably have the least rejection worldwide. Story 54. Almaty, Kazakhstan is the geographic center of the world's population. Story 55. Ideally, it would be egalitarian and for all humanity. Realistically, it would be in Switzerland and cater to 0.1%, so Davis or Dubai, maybe even Idaho. Story 56. Almost all Nordic countries have their priorities straight when it comes to their people. Story 57. Geneva is neutral and international, already accustomed to hosting global egos. Story 58. Because of the number of employees it may bring, a newly constructed city may be the best option. Choose a coastal location with low natural disaster risk and a reliable water supply. The climate should be favorable year-round, not too hot or cold, and the site should be close to a large population. Story 59. Omaha, Nebraska. Hear me out. World government means everyone is under a single government. Correct? Okay. By air, Omaha is roughly as far from London and Paris as it is from Tokyo and Shanghai. It is on a river. The main weather concern is tornadoes. It has 4 seasons. In the unlikely event of an attempted uprising originating outside the present-day United States, Canada, or Mexico, a conventional army would have to land troops in the center of the continent. Good luck. Story 60. I would choose one of the world's major cities, preferably in a politically stable country. Amsterdam, Stockholm, Berlin, Oslo, Tokyo, or Kyoto would be a good choice. If the United States were not in its current state, I would add New York or Los Angeles to the list. Story 61. Anchorage, Alaska. It is roughly in the middle of Europe, the Atlantic coast of the United States, and Western Asia. Story 62. Atlantis. Everyone who wants a world government should be at the bottom of the ocean. Story 63. The North Pole or Antarctica. Seriously, though, somewhere in Japan because they have the best infrastructure. Southern Europe or Northern Africa would also make sense, in my opinion. Story 64. Moscow seems to be doing pretty well for that, maybe. Story 65. Mariehua. It is easier to protect the celestial dragons this way. Story 66. I would like to say Geneva, but the Swiss would probably come after me, and the French would do the same until I agreed to hold 50% of government sessions in Lyon or some other crazy place. Story 67. Costa Rica, a country with no standing army, is a model for a peaceful world government. Story 68. If it were up to me, I would put it somewhere in the Morro Bay, Los Osos, and San Luis Obispo area. I would choose a small but developed location. It should have excellent weather year-round. It would be right in between San Francisco and Los Angeles. It should have a cyberpunk vibe. Story 69. Sydney, Australia, is the headquarters of the United Nations Space Command in the fictional Halo universe. So fuck it. That's my vote. Story 70. A one-world government would be a dystopian nightmare, so I would say Moscow, Beijing, or Berlin. Story 71. A one-world government would be a dystopian nightmare. I would say Moscow, Beijing, and Berlin. Story 72. I am surprised no one is mentioning Tokyo. It is the largest city as defined by the United Nations, has a temperate climate, significant economic importance, and is located in a developed country. Story 73. In a fictional universe I have been building, a government led by black-eyed people emphasizes a horrifying doctrine of total freedom. The capital is centered in the former cities of Dubai and Sharjah, and although that is the core city, its territory extends over up to 70% of the United Arab Emirates. Story 74. How about Antarctica? We could build a superhero-style base there. Story 75. Somewhere in Africa in need of infrastructure development. Story 76. For safety and security reasons related to pandemics, I suggest it be located in Madagascar. Story 77. If I recall correctly, the city nearest the population centroid, the point where the travel distance for every person on Earth is minimized to account for population density, is closest to Almaty, Kazakhstan. Story 78. Does the United Nations building in New York already do this? Story 79. Israel is such a small place, yet everyone fights for that little piece of land. Story 80. Jerusalem is ancient, has a storied history, and is a holy city to billions. Travel there is inconvenient from Oceania and the Americas, but it is fairly central to Africa and Eurasia, so it is accessible to most of the population of the world. If the world government were headquartered there, everyone would have a vested interest in the city and its surrounding territory, which might finally lead to a resolution of the conflict in the Middle East. This would not mean Israel running the world. Rather, a global government would be based in a city that was once part of that nation. Story 81. The United Nations is already in New York City, which makes sense. But realistically, a location in Europe would be the most central for the majority of nations. Story 82. Addis Ababa should be the capital of a world government, because it symbolizes unity between ancient civilizations and modern multilateralism. It hosts the African Union and represents a neutral, globally connected crossroads between continents, cultures, and histories. Story 83. Probably Istanbul. It is geographically central, has good infrastructure, and is on decent terms with the United States, the European Union, Russia, the countries of the Middle East, and China. Story 84. If we could send all politicians to the Pitcairn Islands in the middle of the Pacific, the world would become a better place. Story 85. Suppose the United Nations decided to form a single world government. Where should it place the capital city? Consider current geopolitics and economies, accessibility, and avoid excessive Eurocentrism. The capital should be roughly equidistant from the most populated regions, such as India and China, and ideally on the coast to allow maritime access. The capital may be an existing city or a new one. Give the location and, if possible, coordinates. Story 86. Probably London, but if I were in charge, I would choose Venice. It is so completely impractical that the entire world order would have to change to accommodate the city. Would that ruin Venice? I do not think so. Venice has been doing this kind of thing for 1,000 years. Story 87. New York, Geneva, The Hague, and Singapore would be acceptable, as would any major city in eastern Canada. A newly built city, such as Egypt's new capital, would be more central for much of the world. However, the region is not stable enough to gain wide acceptance. Story 88. Istanbul is historically and geographically a meeting point for Africa, Europe, and Asia. Story 89. Canada is basically already a world government. Probably has more immigrants than native-born Canadians. It has a multicultural society. Story 90. Would it not be important to be near larger economies and military powers? Story 91. I think Singapore. 12 or fewer for most of the world's population. Story 92. The governments of large countries can barely function. Why would anyone want to try for a world government? Story 93. No. There is no need to do anything different with a world government because of technology. I would assume a world government would be like the Galactic Senate from Star Wars. Only issues that affect 2 or more countries would need to be addressed. The Galactic Senate needed a headquarters on Coruscant because the communication technology in Star Wars was ludicrously poor compared with what we have now. Even if such a governing body on Earth were to have a Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, there would still be little need to change anything. Senators would meet in a virtual chamber with virtual reality headsets and avatars. Each country would likely remain largely independently governed by traditional governments, with an Earth Senate ensuring cooperation among countries, similar to how the United States federal government ensures cooperation among states. Finally, a practical use for the metaverse. Story 94. A city in the steppes of Central Asia, far from the centers of wealth. Putting a capital in Europe, East Asia, or the Americas would make it prone to local influence. Ideally, it should be multiple cities with rotating capitals. Story 95. It should be a city centrally located along the Pacific Rim with a significant number of speakers of at least 2 of the 3 major languages: Chinese, English, and Spanish. I suggest Hong Kong or San Francisco. Story 96. Auckland, New Zealand, is isolated and about as neutral as a country can be. It is large enough to handle the load, scenic enough to please all guests, and equally difficult to reach from everywhere except from Australia. Story 97. Washington, District of Columbia, has most everything already except the United Nations. Story 98. New York is the obvious answer, and the world has already acknowledged this by placing the United Nations there. Story 99. I don't think it would be in one location. Look at the United Nations. It is already split between a few cities. By this logic, probably New York or Geneva. Story 100. With virtual meetings common, no single world capital is necessary. Every delegate remains in their own jurisdiction. This concept should be extended to every large country, and Washington should be turned into a museum. Story 101. It would have to be located in a swamp. Why would you want mosquitoes, buildings sinking, disease, and flooding? Story 102. Wellington, New Zealand is far from any conflict zones. We do not initiate wars. We have one of the most highly trained special forces in the world. We typically have friendly relations with the United States, China, and the European Union, and we have no direct conflict with Russia. We are not power hungry. It is the obvious choice. Story 103. Perth, Australia, is far from most other places, limiting the harm a one-world government can do. Story 104. As a defensive position, I was amazed by Toledo, Spain. It is a natural fortress city with defensive walls surrounding a natural plateau. If you are lucky enough to breach the walls, you are met with a maze of narrow streets with buildings 3 stories high towering overhead and raining havoc down on the streets. Inside the city are several smaller fortresses in the form of cathedrals or mosques, depending on who is in charge that day, and fortified armories. Toledo was the Area 51 skunk works of its time at the height of the Spanish Empire. Invaders would be met with the best armor, blades, and guns from the Spanish armory. It was also a great drinking town. Story 105. Rio de Janeiro would be an acceptable location. Cities in North America, Europe, and most of Asia would be troublesome for countries in those regions to accept. Rio is world famous and not tied in any meaningful way to the major powers. Therefore, a compromise by the Central Earth government to accept Rio de Janeiro as the location seems most likely. Story 106. Washington, District of Columbia, obviously. Let the aliens deal with them first. Story 107. One that is already important is New York. but most would probably disregard it because it's in the United States. Apart from that, Brussels or Geneva. Story 108. True neutrality lies beyond the geographical influence of neighboring states. The best option would be an artificial floating city in international waters, powered entirely by renewable energy. Modeled on the International Space Station but accessible to anyone, it would include a desalination plant and integrated microplastic cleanup systems. The project would serve as a proof of concept for governance models and technologies that benefit all humanity. Established under international law, it would require responsible behavior while remaining open to anyone who can reach it by sea. It could serve as a first responder for humanitarian relief by sailing to the nearest international waters to assist people in conflict zones. Story 109. London's airports connect to more locations on Earth than those of any other city. That alone makes it a good hub. Story 110. Ottawa, Canada is an ideal location for a global headquarters due to political stability, direct access to international diplomacy with more than 130 embassies, and proximity to federal decision-makers. The city has a strong technology and innovation ecosystem, often called Silicon Valley North, supported by a highly educated workforce and one of North America's highest concentrations of tech talent. This is complemented by a high quality of life and a competitive cost of doing business, making Ottawa excellent for attracting and retaining a diverse global workforce. The city is officially designated bilingual in English and French. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.